What if I told you there was once a man whose voice could stop a city in its tracks? A preacher so electrifying that entire crowds fainted under the weight of his words. A man who crossed oceans, shook nations, and sparked a movement that rewrote history. Yet today, most people have never even heard his name. His name was George Whitefield. While the world remembers Benjamin Franklin as a founding father, or John Wesley as the father of Methodism, Whitefield's thunderous preaching shook both England and America with a power that no one could ignore. He didn't just preach sermons, he set souls on fire. He didn't just speak to congregations, he spoke to nations. But here's the shocking part. Though he spoke to more people in his lifetime than almost anyone in history, though his voice reached miners underground and noblemen in royal halls, George Whitefield is often forgotten, buried in the shadows of history. And yet, his story may be one of the most important ever told, because what he carried, the secret behind his unstoppable fire, still has the power to change your life. Today, imagine tens of thousands gathered in an open field. No microphones, no speakers, no lights. And yet, one solitary voice rising against the wind, reaching every ear as if it were whispered directly into their soul. People wept. People trembled. Some cried out for mercy. Others fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the presence of God. It wasn't theater. It wasn't manipulation. It was the raw reality of heaven breaking into earth. Who was this man? Where did his fire come from? And why does his name echo faintly today, while others are remembered more brightly? By the end of this video, you will not only know the forgotten story of George Whitefield, you will discover the hidden force that made him unstoppable, and how that very same force can ignite your life with purpose, courage, and faith. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you something. When was the last time you felt truly alive? Not just existing, not just going through the motions, but burning with a passion bigger than yourself. That's exactly what George Whitefield discovered, and it's why his life became a flame that could not be extinguished. And listen, if this story already stirs something in you, I'd love to know your thoughts. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you've ever heard of George Whitefield before. Was his name familiar, or is this the first time you're encountering him? Your perspective matters, because together, we're not just telling history, we're rediscovering it. And if you want more stories like this, where faith and history collide like a living movie, don't forget to like this video. It helps. Bring more people into this journey. Now, let's set the stage. Picture England in the 1700s. A nation of outward religion, but inward emptiness. Churches were filled with cold ritual, while streets were filled with drunkenness, poverty, and despair. Across the ocean, the American colonies were growing restless, caught between survival and identity, waiting for a voice that could call them higher. And in the middle of that spiritual darkness, a frail young boy was born in a tavern in Gloucester. His father died when he was only 2. His childhood was marked not by wealth or privilege, but by struggle and survival. No one could have guessed that this boy, George Whitefield, would one day stand before kings and peasants alike, carrying a message that would change 2 continents. But destiny has a strange way of working. Sometimes God raises the most unlikely, people shaping them in hidden places, preparing them for a fire they cannot yet imagine. So how does a boy from a tavern become the voice that shook nations? That's where our story begins. Because before George Whitefield became the preacher who made hardened miners weep and skeptics like Benjamin Franklin take notice, he was just a young man searching for meaning, wrestling with weakness, longing for something real. And the turning point of his life, the spark that would ignite a global revival, was about to come. Stay with me. Because in the next part, we will walk into the dusty streets of Gloucester, step into the struggles of his youth, and watch the first glimmers of destiny appear. And I promise you, what happens next will surprise you. The year was 1714. In a small English town called Gloucester, the cry of a newborn pierced through the walls of the Bell Inn, a tavern filled with laughter, smoke, and drunken song. That child was George Whitefield, born into a world of noise and brokenness, not nobility or privilege. His father, who owned the inn, would soon die, leaving his mother to raise her children in poverty. Imagine it, a frail little boy running through the wooden floors of a tavern, surrounded by the smell of ale and the sound of quarrels. His home was no sanctuary. It was a stage for the rough edges of life. But in that unlikely environment, God was already watching, preparing a vessel. George was not born strong or healthy. From his earliest years, he battled weakness and frailty. He often described himself as a sickly child, always struggling with his health. And yet, within him, there was an unusual hunger, an ache for something more, something beyond the ordinary world around him. As he grew, George found refuge in stories. He devoured plays and literature, dreaming of standing on stage. He had a natural gift for oratory, for moving people with words, and he longed to become an actor. That dream burned inside him. But life had other plans. Schooling was difficult. Though bright, George couldn't afford the path of ease. His hands were roughened by labor, working to support his struggling family. He served as a drawer of ale in his mother's tavern, carrying heavy jugs, scrubbing floors, and enduring the humiliation of customers who mocked his ragged state. The young boy who longed to stand on a stage instead bent over tables, forgotten and ridiculed. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. At the age of 15, George's passion for drama collided with a new discovery: the Scriptures. He began reading the Bible, not as dry ritual, but with wide eyes and a heart that trembled. Suddenly, the words leapt off the page, alive and burning. The stories of prophets and apostles felt more real than any play he had ever imagined. Could it be that God had written a role for him? A role not on the stage of men, but on the stage of eternity. Still, the path was not smooth. George's longing for God was met with despair over his own sin. He fasted, prayed, punished his body, and tried desperately to earn salvation through sheer effort. He even refused to eat certain foods he enjoyed, sleeping on the floor, exhausting his frail health in pursuit of peace for his soul. Yet no matter how much he strove, the emptiness remained. It was in this season that Whitefield crossed paths with a group of young men at Oxford University known as the Holy Club. Led by the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, this small band of students was mocked by others, who called them Methodists for their strict spiritual disciplines. But what the world ridiculed, heaven was preparing. George was drawn to them, finding in their devotion a mirror of his own hunger. But hunger alone cannot save. One day, exhausted by his striving, George fell ill, so ill that he thought he might die. Lying weak, his body nearly broken, he reached the end of himself. And it was in that weakness that a light pierced the darkness. He encountered the truth of grace, that salvation is not earned by works, but received by faith. It was like chains snapping off his soul. He would later write of that moment, "God was pleased to remove the heavy load, to enable me to lay hold of his dear Son by living faith." This was no small turning. It was as if the young man born in a tavern, who dreamed of the stage, had finally discovered his true script. And from that day, he would never again be the same. But his story was only beginning. The frail boy who once scrubbed floors in a tavern was about to stand on a platform far greater than any theater. And when he opened his mouth, the world would tremble, because just beyond the horizon lay a destiny he could not yet see. A pulpit without walls, a congregation without limits, a fire that would leap from town to town, crossing seas, igniting nations. But before the fire spread, before the thunder of his preaching shook the earth, George Whitefield had to face the first test of his calling. a test that would demand everything. It is one thing to read about the grace of God. It is another to feel it thunder through your soul, breaking chains you thought could never be broken. For George Whitefield, that moment came not in a grand cathedral, but in the quiet agony of a searching heart. Picture it, a young man, frail in body but aflame in spirit, pacing through the dim corridors of Oxford. His health was poor, his body worn from fasting, sleepless nights, and endless striving. Yet now, something had shifted. Grace had touched him. It wasn't his discipline. It wasn't his prayers. It wasn't his works. It was Christ alone. The fire lit within him refused to be contained. He began preaching in small gatherings, his voice trembling at first, then growing with a strange power. People leaned in, astonished at the authority in his words. It was as though every syllable carried eternity behind it. He spoke of the new, birth, not religion, not ritual, but being born again. And when he did, hearts broke. Tears flowed. Something unseen was happening, but the real turning point came when the pulpits of England began to close their doors to him. Yes, close them. His message was too raw, too direct, too unsettling for the religious establishment. Clergymen sneered at him, calling him a fanatic. They barred him from their churches, refusing to let this fiery young preacher disturb their comfortable congregations. Imagine the rejection, the doors of the church, the very place where the gospel should be thundered, shutting in his face. For many, that would have been the end. But for Whitefield, it was the beginning. One morning, standing before yet another locked church, he made a decision that would change history. If they would not let him preach inside, he would preach outside. So he walked to the fields. The year was 1739. A crowd gathered, not of nobles or priests, but of coal miners. Rough men, blackened with soot, their faces hard from labor and their hearts hardened by despair. No choir, no pulpit, no stained glass. Just sky, earth, and one young man with a burning message. Whitefield lifted his voice, and something miraculous happened. As he preached the new birth, tears streamed down the miners' cheeks. White lines appeared on their darkened faces as coal, dust mixed with tears. Hardened men sobbed openly, crying out for mercy. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of heaven's presence. It was no longer about pulpits or institutions. God had broken free of the walls, and revival was loose in the open air. News spread like wildfire. Soon thousands gathered in fields, streets, and marketplaces. Whitefield's voice, strangely powerful, as if supernaturally amplified, carried across vast crowds. Benjamin Franklin himself once calculated that as many as 30,000 people could hear him at once without any microphone. Picture that, tens of thousands standing silent, hanging on every word, while one man lifted his voice like a trumpet. This was not ordinary oratory. It was as if heaven itself had lent Whitefield its lungs. But wherever God moves, opposition rises. Authorities accused him of disorder, of disturbing the peace. Religious leaders denounced him as dangerous. Yet no persecution could silence him. The fire within was greater than the pressure without. This was the turning point, not simply his personal conversion, but his decision to break free from the limits of tradition and obey the voice of God, no matter the cost. And here is where his story collides with ours. How many times do we too face closed doors? A dream denied, an opportunity lost, a voice telling us we're unworthy, unqualified, or unwanted. But what if the closed doors are not the end? What if they are the beginning? George Whitefield discovered that when man says no, God can still open a field. When pulpits shut, the sky becomes a cathedral. When tradition rejects you, God himself makes room for your calling. And that truth, that freedom, is still alive today. By now, Whitefield was not just a preacher. He was a phenomenon. Crowds grew, Conversions multiplied, and the stirrings of revival spread across England. But God was not finished. There was another land waiting, a land across the ocean, where 13 colonies were restless, searching for identity, yearning for awakening. And so George Whitefield would board a ship. His voice, already shaking England, was about to thunder across America, and what happened there would mark history forever. The waves crashed against the ship as George Whitefield crossed the Atlantic. His frail body, often sick from the journey, seemed the opposite of the unstoppable force his preaching had become. But when his feet touched American soil, something extraordinary began to unfold. The colonies in the 1740s were restless, fractured by social class, struggling with identity, and spiritually dry. Churches were cold, people were indifferent, and yet beneath the surface, hearts longed for something real. Into this spiritual drought came a young preacher whose very voice seemed to awaken the dead. Whitefield began preaching in fields, barns, and streets. Crowds swelled to thousands. Farmers left their plows in the fields. Merchants closed their shops. Families traveled miles by foot or horseback, just to hear him. Reports tell us that whole towns seemed to come alive after his sermons. Taverns emptied, theaters closed, people wept openly in the streets. Benjamin Franklin, no believer himself, became one of Whitefield's closest friends. Curious about this preacher's power, Franklin once stood at the edge of a massive outdoor gathering in Philadelphia. With his scientific mind, he measured how far Whitefield's voice carried, calculating that over 30,000 people could hear him clearly. Franklin was astonished, not just at the voice, but at the sheer impact, and it wasn't just crowds. It was souls. Thousands upon thousands were converted. Hardened skeptics, wealthy landowners, slaves, servants, young, old. It made no difference. The message of the new birth swept through the colonies like wildfire. This was the Great Awakening, a spiritual revolution that didn't just change lives, but helped shape the identity of a nation. For the first time, people across the colonies felt united under something greater than politics, greater than social class. They were united by the experience of God's power, by the conviction that every soul mattered, that everyone must be born again. Whitefield preached up and down the eastern seaboard, from Georgia to New England. By the time he was done, it is estimated he preached over 18,000 sermons to millions of people, an almost impossible feat in an age without technology. But his impact wasn't just in numbers. It was in the depth of transformation. Families were restored. Alcoholics sobered. Communities once marked by chaos became known for prayer and worship. A spiritual hunger was awakened that influenced generations to come. And yet Whitefield's story was not without scars. He faced harsh criticism. Many church leaders despised him, calling him a troublemaker, an actor, a fanatic. His health suffered from his relentless schedule. He often preached multiple times a day, in every kind of weather, until his body was completely spent. But still, he pressed on. Why? Because he believed he was a man under orders. He once said, "I would rather wear out than rust out," and wear out he did. His entire life became a living sacrifice for the sake of souls. Even in death, his legacy thundered. On September 30th, 1770, weakened and near collapse, Whitefield was urged by friends to rest. But crowds gathered, begging him to preach just once more. With failing strength, he climbed the stairs of a small house in Massachusetts, lit a candle, and preached his final sermon by its flickering light. That night, he breathed his last. He died as he had lived, preaching the gospel until his final breath. But the fire he lit did not die. It spread. His sermons, his passion, his example fueled not only the Great Awakening, but also the fires of freedom that would shape America's revolution. His insistence that all are equal before God planted seeds of unity and courage that influenced the very DNA of a nation. Think about it. A boy born in a tavern in Gloucester, frail and unknown, became a voice that shook 2 continents. From England to America, from miners in fields to crowds of tens of thousands, George Whitefield's legacy is proof of what God can do with a life fully surrendered. And here is where the reflection comes to us. What if we lived with the same urgency? What if our days were spent not chasing comfort but eternity? What if our voices carried not just words, but fire from heaven? The story of George Whitefield is not just history. It's a challenge, a call, a reminder that one surrendered life, filled with God's Spirit, can ripple across generations. But what does this mean for us today? That is where we will go next. Because Whitefield's legacy is not simply about the past. It's about the choice you and I face in this very moment. A voice that once echoed across fields and cities has long been silenced by time. The crowds have dispersed. The candle that flickered in that Massachusetts attic went out more than 2 centuries ago. And yet, the story of George Whitefield still burns, because what truly matters is not the man, but the flame that consumed him, the fire of the gospel. That fire is still alive today. Think about it. George Whitefield had no microphone, no social media, no camera to broadcast his words. He had only a frail body, a borrowed voice, and an unshakable conviction that God had called him to preach Christ crucified. And with that, he shook 2 continents. So what's stopping us? You don't need to stand before 30,000 people to change the world. You don't need a pulpit, a platform, or a title. What you need is what Whitefield had, a surrendered heart and the courage to obey. When God fills a vessel, even the weakest becomes unstoppable. Whitefield's life whispers across time to you and me. Don't waste your life. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Don't silence the fire God has placed in you. Speak, love, live with eternity in view. His story also confronts us with a question. Are we content to drift through life, chasing comfort and fading pleasures? Or will we dare to burn bright, even if the world misunderstands us? Whitefield was ridiculed, rejected, and resisted. But none of that mattered, because he had already died to himself. He lived for a greater audience, the audience of one. And this is where the past collides with the present. His legacy is not meant to be admired from afar, like a painting in a museum. It is meant to ignite us, to remind us that history is still being written, and that ordinary people, people like you, can leave extraordinary marks when surrendered to God. So let me ask you, what is your field? Who are your 30,000? Maybe it's not a literal crowd. Maybe it's your family, your co-workers, your friends, your neighborhood. Maybe it's one person who needs hope, one voice crying out for encouragement. You may never know the full impact of your obedience, but heaven will. Whitefield preached until his final breath. His words were temporary, but the souls he touched were eternal. And today, the same Spirit that gave him strength is available to you. The same grace that lifted him from despair can lift you. The same fire that burned in him can burn in your heart, and so the question remains, will you let it? If this story has stirred something inside you, don't let it fade away when the video ends. Take a step, surrender, pray, speak, share, let your life echo eternity, just as his did. And here's something I'd love to do together. Leave a comment below sharing what part of George Whitefield's story touched you the most. Was it his courage to preach in the open fields? His relentless passion even in sickness? Or the sheer power of his voice carrying across thousands? I want to hear your heart, because your reflection might ignite someone else's faith too. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Not for numbers, but because we are building a community of people who want to see more stories like this. Stories where faith is alive, history comes to life, and our hearts are set on fire for God. George Whitefield's life ended in 1770, but in truth, it never ended. The seeds he planted continue to bear fruit, rippling across time, shaping generations. And now, it's our turn. Because the forgotten preacher who shook 2 continents has left us with a challenge that cannot be ignored. Will you burn with the same fire?